In this lecture, Dr. Michael Eades looks at 40 years of flawed science and wonders what can we do to change the world's thinking on nutrition. This is from someone who's been thinking about this for a very long time.
That's actually not what I'm going to talk about at all. That's what it says, but I think that the speech got said after the program. I'm going to talk about paleopathology and the origins of the low-carb diet. And I had to clear up a little mistake that Dr. Noakes made the other day. He said I was from Little Rock, and I was. My wife and I practiced in Little Rock for a long time, but we haven't lived there for about 15 or 16 years. And now we split our time between Santa Barbara and Lake Tahoe. And interesting story about Santa Barbara, I have a really good friend there who's an orthopedic surgeon who trained in Cape Town. And when he came to the States, he wanted to find a place as close to Cape Town as he could get, and he found Santa Barbara. So now that I've spent some time in Cape Town, it really is close. They really are pretty similar. But anyway, we escaped from Arkansas 15 or 16 or 17 years ago, and there's a saying that there's only two ways you can escape from Arkansas. You either make a lot of money or you get elected. And fortunately, we had a best-selling book, so that allowed us to escape. Bill Clinton got elected. Now we've been talking about childhood obesity, so I want to show you a picture here. This is a group of kids back in the 50s in Arkansas in a little town called Hot Springs. And if you look at this picture, it's like all pictures of little kids back then. You have little skinny kids and one big old fat kid. And in this case, the big old fat kid is none other than Bill Clinton. And this little skinny barefooted girl right here is my wife, who grew up right across the street from Bill Clinton. So anyway, we've got pictures all over our house of Bill Clinton and my wife together, and I've interrogated her closely, and nothing. So anyway, if you see her and want to hear a funny story, ask her about the time we showed up at the White House unannounced and crashed the Oval Office. So anyway, I want to talk about some other kinds of data that sort of justify the low-carb diet. Now, this is Mark Nathan Cohen, who's an anthropologist, and he has this great quote that says, "The field of medicine often appears naive about the full range of human biological experience, basing conclusions about human health, even about what's normal, on the comparatively narrow experience of contemporary Western society." Now, that's what we've been hearing about the whole time in this conference, is randomized controlled trials, medical science, Western medicine. So today we're going to look at some other stuff that I hope you'll find as interesting as I have. And it wouldn't be me if I didn't start out with a book. Now, this is a book by an old doctor named Blake Donaldson, who's been dead for a long time. This book was written back in the early 1960s, and Dr. Donaldson was a practitioner in New York City. And he had come up on the idea that we as humans had been sort of forged in the crucible of natural selection. And as he puts it, during the millions of years that our ancestors lived by hunting, every weakling who could not maintain perfect health on fresh fat, meat, and water was bred out. And he had his practice in Manhattan, and he treated everyone with an all-meat diet. If you came in with a weight problem, you got an all-meat diet. If you came in with heart disease, you got an all-meat diet. If you came in with arthritis, you got an all-meat diet. If you came in with GI problems, you got an all-meat diet. And he had quite a bit of success with it, and that's what this book is about. And you can actually find this book on Amazon for a reasonable price, and it makes for very interesting reading. But I've got to warn you in advance, if you're females, that you will be outraged because he is patronizing and condescending to his female patients, sort of like a lot of crusty old doctors were back in the 50s and 60s, so just be forewarned. Now, if you look at our evolution, the evolution of humanity, you can see, and this is data that I got from Lauren Cordain. Now, there's an old saying that if you steal from one person, you plagiarize. If you steal from a whole bunch of people, you call it research. So I've stolen from a whole bunch of people. So I'm calling this research, and I stole this from Lauren Cordain. But anyway, you can see that 99.6% of all Homo generations had no evolutionary experience with commonly consumed modern foods introduced during the Neolithic. So we're basically hunter-gatherers at the core. And so what applies to hunter-gatherers should apply to us. Now, in order to get all this data that I'm going to present to you, I had to make this huge sacrifice, and I had to get into the anthropological literature. Now, if you think the medical literature is arcane, you can't believe the anthropological literature. This is, in either case, human operators could be treated as fully determined by the learning context in which they grew up. In the extreme environmental determinism, artifacts were merely dead ends. Although they clearly had been produced by humans, artifacts did not need to be integrated into the behavioral systems which humans articulate with, respond to, and manipulate, and blah, 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 blah. That's anthropology speak. And you get some great things in there. I saw this one paper where the guy was referring to elk and bison and bear and moose, and instead of calling them that, he called them charismatic megafauna. So anyway, this is anthropology speak, and I had to wade through all that to dig out this data that I'm going to present. Now, the first section, I've got 4 different little sections that I want to talk about, and the first one is one of the great thought experiments of all time, in my view. And it was a paper published by Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler, and it was called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And it has its origin in Kleiber's law. Now, Max Kleiber was a Swiss physiologist who taught at University of California at Davis for a long time in the late 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And Dr. Kleiber was really interested in metabolism. And he ended up writing a famous, am I pushing the right thing? A famous book called The Fire of Life, an introduction to animal energetics. And that's a copy of my book right there. When I was looking this up on Amazon, the only copy they had available was over $2,000. So I'm really glad I've got a pristine one. But anyway, what Dr. Kleiber did is he was trying to find a correlation between metabolic rate and weight. And so he measured the metabolic rates of mice and horses and just about everything in between, and he came up with this graph. And this is the actual graph that was published in the Physiological Reviews back in 1947. Back then they were a little bit primitive in their publishing, and so this is actually a hand-drawn graph, and if you get that article, that's what you'll see. And what he found out is that there's a line, that there's a correlation that virtually every living thing falls on that's a function of metabolic rate and body weight. So if you can figure out the body weight on that line, you can figure out the metabolic rate, and vice versa. And so if you look at it, humans fall right on that line, human males and human females. So this is where Aiello and Wheeler took off on this. And they said, okay, let's take a look. If we have a primate, okay, a 65 kilogram primate, what's it look like? If we break down all the components of its body and measure the metabolic rates of each one, how are they going to be spread out on this thing? And here they are. You've got the brain's got a little bit of the metabolic rate. You got the gut's got a whole lot. The liver's got a fair amount. The kidneys, the heart. The muscles, strangely enough, in terms of resting metabolic rate, are not very much. They don't make up but about 4 or 5% of the total metabolic rate, the total resting metabolic rate. The brain makes up a huge amount in humans, and it makes up an okay amount in primates, but there's a lot that the gut takes up because the gut is very metabolically active. So what they said is if a hominin, a pre-human that weighed 65 kilograms would fit on Kleiber's line, that it ought to be about like this. And what they found out instead was that it looked like that. The brain chewed up a ton more of the metabolic rate, and something had to give. And it couldn't be the heart, it couldn't be the kidneys, it couldn't be the spleen, it couldn't be really anything else. And what it ended up being was the GI tract. And so these pre-humans basically sacrificed GI tract for brain, because you're constrained by Kleiber's law. They couldn't just say, okay, we're going to keep our guts and raise our metabolic rates because we grow a bigger brain. They were metabolically constrained by basically Kleiber's law. So this is what happened. So what happened? What happened to the guts? Okay, if you look at this picture, you can see that that Homo sapiens has a hugely high brain to gut ratio. And the metabolic rate of the brain is about 9 times higher than the mass-specific metabolic rate of the body as a whole. And you can see that the Homo sapiens is way out here on this end, way away from everything. These are other primates. And if you look at the chest cavities, you can see again that this is a chimpanzee over here. If you follow the line, you can see that they've got big bellies. This is an Australopithecus afarensis. That's Lucy. You can see again a big belly, but you can see the belly starts to narrow because it's not as large, because they gave up their guts to develop larger brains. Now here are a bunch of primates, and if you look at them, you can see the same thing in each of them. They've got, the makings of big bellies, and the human has kind of got a waistline. Now, if you look at a gorilla, you can see this in action. If you look at chimpanzee, you can see the big belly. And if you look at an Inuit from the late 1930s, you can see what a hunter-gatherer looks like. Now, this photograph was taken by a Norwegian whose name, a Norwegian friend told me how to pronounce it, Arne Huyegard. And for obvious reasons, I'm going to call him Højgaard. But anyway, Højgaard took, he was a Norwegian physician, and he made this expedition that he funded to Greenland, to a remote area of Greenland where there were Inuit that had not had contact with Europeans, and they were living in their traditional way. And so he ran every test imaginable on these people, and he actually took photographs of them, which is interesting because I've been a doctor for over 35 years, and I've seen a lot of naked people in my time. I've never seen a naked Inuit, and I've really never seen a naked Inuit that was living on a hunter-gatherer diet. And when you see them, and the monograph he wrote, there are tons of pictures of both male and female, and these are people that are eating a very low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And this guy is pretty typical. He's a 25-year-old one. And he doesn't look like a bodybuilder, but that's what all these people looked like. And the females kind of looked the same way, except they had breasts. And they wouldn't be recruited for the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. And they were living on a strictly Paleolithic diet, which has caused me to wonder if the body ideal that we have, especially for females right now, is really realistic given our anthropological heritage. But at any rate, you can see the different waistlines in the different people, or the different primates. Now, the reason they had such big bellies is because they had to eat a lot to sustain themselves if they didn't eat meat. Now, this is a little thing that I created. I went through the USDA nutrient database and put all these together. And if you're going to get 65% of your calories from a 3,000 calorie diet, this is what you have to eat. Now, you don't have to eat all those, but you're going to have to eat 10.3 pounds of carrots, or you're going to have to eat 23.5 pounds of tomatoes, 6 pounds of potatoes, 26 pounds of celery. And remember, these are all modern vegetables. These have been Luther Burbanked. These are made to be big and more carby. If you found these things in the wild, they wouldn't be like this at all, and you'd have to eat a much larger volume to get the calories you need. So anyway, the only explanation for this shrinkage of the gut to go along with the increase in brain size is that they started to eat meat. And if you look at the hominin sort of increase in cranial capacity over time, you can see a real jump that takes off right here that corresponds with starting to hunt large game. And so it's the hunting, the conversion from a basically plant-based diet to a meat-based diet that allowed brains to grow and caused guts to shrink, because we didn't need the gut because meat's a much more complete food that doesn't require the same type of digestion that plant foods do. Now, this is what Aiello and Wheeler said, is that you've got this more complex, you got a higher quality diet because you're eating meat. That allows you to have a smaller gut, gives you increased energy availability to let you grow a larger brain. And sort of the old way of thinking is that there was more complex foraging behavior that people had to do as they developed, and that drove the development of the larger brain. But they made the case that they thought it was the switch to meat consumption that drove the larger brain formation. And so, what it all boils down to is we didn't really evolve to eat meat, we evolved because we ate meat. And it was put much more eloquently by a friend of mine who wrote a great book that everyone should read. And she said, the wild herds of aurochs and horses invented us out of their bodies, their nutrient-dense tissues gestating the human brain. And that's exactly what happened. And if you know anybody that's a vegetarian that you want to break from it, get this book, The Vegetarian Myth by Lierre Keith. It's absolutely wonderful, beautifully written. Okay, now, that's the Leslie Aiello. Now, this is a great paper, and I'm going to have this available on my website if I don't already, because everybody ought to have a copy of this, The Expensive Tissue Hypothesis. And I spoke with Leslie Aiello about it, and she had a hell of a time getting it published. Current Anthropology, which was the journal it was published in, thought it was too complicated for their readers. And so she had a tough time getting it published, and now it's one of their most, if not the most, cited article in the journal. Okay, I want to switch gears now and talk to about stable isotope analysis. Now, stable isotope analysis is a way that you can look into the actual hunter-gatherers from thousands of years past and tell what they ate. So this is a mass spectrometer right here, and this is the machine you do it with. And so we'll go through a little bit of just elementary chemistry. The atomic nucleus of an element is the protons plus the neutrons. An element is made up of a constant number of proteins and a variable number of neutrons. The number of protons gives its atomic weight. So carbon, for example, has an atomic weight of 6 because it's got 6 protons. The number of protons plus neutrons equals the atomic mass. So the atomic mass varies a little bit because different elements have different numbers of neutrons. So the carbon atom, for example, has got 6 protons, as I said, so atomic number of 6, but it can have either 6, 7, or 8 neutrons. So here we've got it with the 6 protons and 6 neutrons, so its atomic weight's 12, and this is called carbon-12. If you look at carbon-13, you see it's added an extra neutron. Its atomic weight is 13. And elements with differing atomic weights are called isotopes. And these can be identified with a mass spectrometer. Now, carbon-12 is one that we're interested in studying. Carbon-13 is one we're interested in studying because those are stable isotopes. Those have not changed over time. Okay? Carbon-14 has changed over time. It has a radioactive decay. It's an unstable isotope. It's what they use to do carbon dating because the rate of decay is known, so you can tell how much is left. You can work backwards and tell, by knowing how much is left and knowing the rate of decay, you can tell how many years ago it started or it was born if you're looking at an animal. But we're not going to use carbon-14 because it's unstable. Then we've got nitrogen-14 and we've got nitrogen-15, and those are the ones that we're interested in because those are the ones that are going to tell us what the diet was of ancient man and ancient man's predecessors. So, since 12 and 13 are stable, there's been virtually no change in the ratio between them over time, but the ratio differs between different carbon-containing substances. And when a sample goes to the mass spectrometer, it determines this carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio. And this figure is compared to a standard, and the standard is called the relative carbon-13 content. That's the symbol for it. This is all leading up to graphs that you can understand, and it's measured in parts per thousand. So if a sample has a ratio less than the standard by 5 parts per thousand, it's called relative 13C with a value of -5, whatever you call that. Okay, now, what you find out when you do these stable isotope analyses is that carbon-13 is found in larger quantities in marine animals than it is in terrestrial animals. And what you find over time, when you're looking over evolutionary time spans, is that there's been a shift from terrestrial animals to marine animals. And by marine animals, I don't mean just animals that come from the ocean. This is freshwater fish, this is mussels, this is snails, this is anything that lives in fresh water. And the theory is that for a long time, humans had big game to hunt and had high fat content, and that's what they went after. And they were extremely skilled hunters, early man. And they basically hunted this stuff to extinction. It took them 1,000 years to go from crossing the Bering Strait and wipe out all the big game from the Bering Strait to the tip of South America. I mean, that's how skilled they were. They were very good hunters. And so when they got rid of the large game, they had to turn to the smaller game. And so you can see this shift over time from a more terrestrial to a more marine diet. So this indicates a diet higher in seafood over time. So this is what we've been talking about. Now, so the carbon-13 ratio, the relative carbon-13, kind of tells whether we ate terrestrially or marine animals. But what the nitrogen, the relative nitrogen-15 tells us is what we ate. Did we eat plant or did we eat meat? Because plants contain a fairly constant nitrogen-15, all right? So if an herbivore eats plants, they concentrate this nitrogen-15 in their collagen. Now, if you analyze this isn't going to tell you what the herbivore had for lunch yesterday. This is going to tell you what the herbivore ate over a long period of time, because this concentrates in the collagen, much like mercury concentrates in us. If we eat a lot of fish that has a little bit of mercury in it over time, the mercury content concentrates. So this is what happens. So when herbivores eat plants, they concentrate the nitrogen-15 by about 5 to 8% in their collagen, and so you can see that. So you do an isotope analysis of flora of the area and find out what the nitrogen-15 is, and then you measure the collagen of an animal, which you can get from the bone, and then you see what it is, and you can say, okay, if it's 5 to 8% higher than what the sort of the ambient level is in the plant food, then it's an herbivore. Now, if the collagen sample contains an N15 level greater than 7% by the local flora, okay, then the animal, oh, wait a minute, if it contains that, it's an herbivore. I got ahead of myself. But here is our paleo family out getting ready to presumably eat this rabbit that the kid is dressing out. It's going to be a meager meal for the bunch of them, but that was the only picture I could find that was appropriate. But anyway, if other animals eat herbivores, they concentrate the nitrogen-15 even further, and they run it up another 7 or 8%. So if you see it's up another 7 or 8% over what the herbivores are, you can say, okay, this is a carnivore. And then some carnivores, which I call super carnivores, actually eat not only herbivores, but they eat other carnivores, and so they're even higher on the scale than your regular carnivores, like foxes and wolves. So if you look at this, now for this long chemistry lesson, we get to the payoff, which shows, let's say, what did the Neanderthals eat? If you look at this, you see that these are all herbivores down here. This is a bison and a deer and another herbivore of some kind, and you see that these are, this is a wolf and this is a fox. So that you can see that Neanderthals fell right in the range of carnivores. In fact, they're kind of super carnivores because they're over this range. And these are studies done by a guy named Michael Richards, who's the big guru in the stable isotope analysis for diet of early man. And I met him a long time ago, and we've gone back and forth. And before I did this talk, I emailed him and said, hey, have there been any changes? I don't want to tell all these people something that's not right. And he said, no, that's pretty much it. This is Neanderthals. Now look at early humans. This is from 12,000 years ago. And what you see is that you've got a wild horse here, you've got an auroch, which was a primitive, or a deer actually, an auroch, which was a primitive kind of predecessor to cattle, and over here you've got an Arctic fox, and look at the humans. So they're way up on that end of the spectrum. So early humans ate meat. Now what this doesn't tell you is it doesn't tell you what amount of carb they ate. But the fact that they ate so much more meat than foxes do, and we know foxes don't eat a lot of carbs, you can make the reasonable assumption that early man, that we sort of cut our evolutionary teeth on a low carb, high fat, or at least high protein diet based on the stable isotope analyses, okay? And here are just some numbers if you want to look at them that are, and Richard says, we were testing the hypothesis that these humans had a mainly hunting economy and therefore a diet high in animal protein. We found this to be the case. So let's switch to our third method of looking at this. Now, there are a lot of these studies out there. There are studies all over the place that show that when man converted from hunting gathering to agriculture, his health went to hell in a handbasket. I mean, stature decreased, bone cortical thickness got less, signs of disease went up, tooth decay became present really for the first time, periosteal disease, periodontitis. I mean, the whole sort of array of diseases that we're afflicted with today came when agriculture came. And an anthropologist can look at a set of human remains, as they call them, and tell like that, is this a hunter-gatherer or is this an agriculturalist? And so there are a lot of studies out here that are telling you what this one is going to tell you, but I like this one because the two groups that were studied were similar. They were two societies with different means of subsistence. The study subjects were skeletal remains. You had 285 hunter-gatherers, 296 farmers. And the hunter-gatherers lived in western Kentucky at about 3,500 BC, so 5,500 years ago. The farmers were more recent. They lived there about 1500 AD, but these were all pre-contact societies. Obviously, the first one was. The second one had not made contact with Europeans. And the thing that made these interesting to study is that they're probably the same genetic material because they're in the same area. And number two, they were non-nomadic. Now, usually hunter-gatherers are nomadic. And so when you compare hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists, you've always got to take that into consideration because agriculturalists had a lot more disease. And so a lot of people say, well, they had this disease because they lived crammed together and the hunter-gatherers were out wandering around, roaming all over the place. So they didn't get the disease. But these groups both stayed put, and they had their own little, basically cities where they lived for each one about 200 years. And so they've gathered this skeletal evidence, and what they find in this was that the hunter-gatherers, and they get this data by analyzing the remains of plants and animal foods, which is amazing if you read the anthropological literature what they can find. But they ate a low-carbohydrate diet composed of river mussels, snails, deer, black bears, small mammals, squirrels, porcupine, raccoon, rabbit, woodchuck, beavers. The list is really a lot longer. Wild turkeys, turtle, fish, and the occasional dog, ceremonially, apparently. And they gathered wild grapes, acorns, blackberries, sunflowers, and hickory nuts. So they had really basically a low-carb, high-protein, higher-fat diet. The farmers ate a low-protein, high-carbohydrate diet composed primarily of corn, beans, and pumpkin. And they also gathered some wild plants and had the occasional deer, elk, or turkey. It wasn't very often. And corn was the weaning food for young children, which is important. Now, what you find when you see the analysis of these is you see this condition called parodic hyperostosis on the top and cribra orbitalia on the bottom. And if you see this parodic hyperostosis, you see all this moth-eaten, grungy stuff on the top of the skull, and you see the same thing inside the eye socket here. That is a sign of iron deficiency anemia, and that you can find on skeletal remains, and you know that the person who owned that skeleton was iron deficient. So this is commonly found when societies switch to an agrarian lifestyle, especially if they switch to corn. And in the case of our study here, the hunters and the gatherers was present in 50% of children. Now, it's apparently very painful. So these poor kids had this. So these 50% of children under 5 years old in the farming society had this problem, and there were none in the hunters. If you look at this is called enamel hypoplasia. And these are lines in the teeth like this, right there. And that is indicative of a severe nutritional stress. Something bad happened, you went without food for a long time, you couldn't lay down enamel on your teeth. Now that was vastly more prevalent among the farmers. And that's typically what you see in agricultural societies because they're dependent on a crop. And if something happens to the crop, they're screwed. And so they're out foraging around, which they're not very skilled at doing. and they have a real nutritional stress. And it's evidenced by this enamel hypoplasia that's very commonly seen in agricultural societies. Now you have these, they're called growth arrest lines, and these are these little lines that you see radiographically in bones, and those indicate periods of sort of short-term nutritional stress. And these are actually more common in hunter-gatherers, because the theory is that they were stressed occasionally, but they figured it out and got something to eat, but they did have these stresses from time to time. You don't see these that often in agriculturalists. You see the severe nutritional stress in agriculturalists. Now, tooth decay was absolutely rampant in farmers, and you can look at this and you can see, bad tooth decay. You can see up here a tooth abscess. I mean, that had to hurt like crazy. I don't know if anybody's ever had a tooth abscess. When people come into the clinic and they're complaining of their jaw hurting, and you go around and you tap it with a tongue depressor, you have to peel them off the ceiling. I mean, these things really hurt, and you can see that the pus has eroded beneath the root of the tooth. I mean, these are really miserable, and this can convert into a systemic infection and can kill people. But tooth decay was rampant in the farmers, which it always is in agriculturalists. An average of 7 caries or 7 cavities per skull, and there was actually tooth loss in children from severe decay, and there were fewer than 1 caries in hunters, and some tooth loss in old age secondary to wear. And that's the typical picture when you see the difference between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists. This is a syndrome called periosteal inflammation, and it occurred in both groups, and that's an infection around the bone, and it's probably a treponemal infection, sort of a variant of yaws. It was really fairly common back then, but it was 13 times more common in the agriculturalists than it was in the hunters. So what that tells you is the hunters, because of their better diet probably, were more immune to infection. And some of the other findings that you have in this is a long article. I'll also have this on my website because I think this is just a great article. The life expectancy was lower among farmers. Infant mortality was much higher among the farmers. More farmer children infected than hunters. And overall, this is the lady that did this study, Claire Cassidy, this is her summation. Overall, the agricultural hardened villagers were clearly less healthy than the Indian knollers. And I've saved you from a lot because I've called them farmers and hunters. If you read through the stuff, they're called hardened villagers and Indian knollers, and I could never keep straight which one was the hunter and which one was the agriculturist. So I've spared you that by calling them farmers and hunters. So anyway, the agricultural hardened villagers were clearly less healthy than the Indian knollers who lived by hunting and gathering. So that's the third thing we're going to look at today. Now, this is Jared Diamond in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. The adoption of agriculture, supposedly our most decisive step toward a better life, was in many ways a catastrophe from which we've never recovered. Now, I like to think of this in terms of cattle. Now, if you think about cows, I mean, they're big, and they're dumb, and they're slow, and they're, dare I say it, bovine. And had they not been good to eat, they would have been hunted to extinction long ago. But we formed this covenant basically with cattle and said, hey, we're gonna protect you and save you from extinction. And we've done that, and now there are millions and millions and millions of cattle out there that would be gone. And what the cattle have traded for that is that we eat them, but they've been saved as a species basically, which is probably not a lot of consolation to the steer that's trudging toward the slaughterhouse, but nonetheless, that's the situation. We find ourselves in sort of the same situation. Civilization was good for us. It allowed us to have a specialization of labor. It allowed us to free up time for creative people to create because other people were growing the crops. And agriculture basically built us as a civilization. If we stayed hunter-gatherers, we probably wouldn't be civilized. So agriculture made us a civilization, and it was great for mankind, but it was not good for the individual man. So let's take a look at another society. Now, these are the ancient Egyptians. group that I'm really interested in, and the thing that triggered my whole interest in this paleopathology when I read about it in a book and sent me off down this rabbit trail of finding all this stuff. But the ancient Egyptian diet is basically wheat-based, bread-based. You can see this picture, and everything in this picture is involved in making bread and dealing with wheat. Here's a picture from Ramsey's Bakery, and you can see them all in there, baking away. They made millions of different kinds of loaves. And I just attended, 2 years ago, a thing in the Louvre in Paris. There was an exhibition of Egyptian artifacts. And I had my camera with me, and I started taking these pictures of bread because I knew sooner or later I was going to give this. I used to give this talk all the time, but I knew sooner or later I was going to give it again, and I wanted some fresh pictures. And it didn't take long before I had OD'd on pictures of Egyptians making bread. I mean, it was a huge, huge, huge part of their culture. And in fact, the Egyptian diet in general, you would consider a modern nutritionist nirvana. So if you think about it, if you think about what the Egyptians ate, which we'll see in a minute, it was exactly what any nutritionist, and I'm not talking about nutritionists in this room, I'm talking about your mainstream nutritionist. It's the diet that any mainstream nutritionist would recommend to a patient who came in with heart disease or obesity or diabetes. It was exactly the diet, okay? It's a modern nutritionist nirvana. They had no sugar. Sugar was still 700 or 800 years away from being discovered. They had no polyunsaturated fats. They had no bad oils. They had no trans fats. They had stone ground, coarse whole wheat bread, vegetables, fruit, a little bit of honey, and a little bit of meat. So we can see, I'm going to bore you with some of the stuff at the Louvre. These are pictures, or these are little statuettes of Egyptians making bread. And I mean, we could be up here all day looking at these, but it's just really prevalent. That was the staple of the ancient Egyptian diet. And it was coarse ground whole wheat bread, and it was difficult to grind the wheat. And they used emmer wheat, which now people are going back to because they want to, especially since the book Wheat Belly, because they want to get rid of this new dwarf wheat. They don't want to eat that, so they want to eat emmer wheat. Well, that's what the Egyptians ate. And so they ate this emmer wheat. It's difficult to grind, and so they had to do this thing where they went out on this rock thing to grind it, and it was even difficult then. So what they would do is they would mix sand in with it to make it grind more easily. And so they would get it ground, and then the big task was trying to sift the sand away. So the bread was always a little bit gritty, and when you read the Egyptian stuff, they're always talking about, so-and-so sells gritty bread. And so, that was a big deal back then, being able to sift as much of the sand out as possible. And there was a real consequence for this, from this, as we'll see. So most important food was bread. The fondness of Egyptians for bread was so well known that they were nicknamed, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, I think it's artophagoi, or eaters of bread. And their military was actually rationed 4 pounds of this bread a day as a food. Now, the Egyptians did eat other things. If you look, you can see that they would snare these migratory waterfowl. Plus they had their own chickens, but they snared these migratory waterfowl as they came along. And most of the big animals they used as beasts of burden. I mean, those were too valuable to eat. They speared fish in the Nile, and they grew a lot of wheat. And so their diet was composed primarily of carbohydrates, breads, fruits, vegetables, honeys. They did have oils, olive oil, flaxseed oil, safflower, and sesame, and then they had fish and waterfowl, and the occasional red meat. And some animals were raised to provide, power for agricultural operations. Others were raised as a source of food, thus adding a modicum of meat protein to the monotonous basic diet of carbohydrates. And fowl appear to have been abundant. These are quotes from books on the ancient Egyptian diet. About hens and roosters, we can say only that, as is still their wont today. They seem to have been all over the place. Now, these are books, and this is important, these are books from historians that have studied the ancient Egyptian diet, because we're going to see a little turnaround in just a minute. But these are the people that have studied the ancient Egyptian diet based on what it really was. Now, what happened from the ancient Egyptian diet? Well, they got fat. And if you look at the drawings on the tombs, those are all idealized. It's just like if you looked at, Better Homes and Gardens or Sports Illustrated today, you would think everybody today was thin. It's the same there. It was the same way in ancient Egypt, but for whatever reason, their statuary was more accurate and depicted what they really looked like. And so if you look at the statuary, you can see a lot better. And what you see too is this guy has got gynecomastia, i.e. man boobs, which they all did. And this is from the phytoestrogens in all the wheat that they ate. And they had a female kind of body habitus from the phytoestrogen. And you can just see example. Here again, same thing. Where is he? See the guy with the belly and the boobs. Another one. There's, an overweight female. And this guy is great. This is in the museum in Berlin. I took that. And where did he go? Wait a minute, how did that happen? That's my favorite one. Oh, no, we're going to have to go over this all again. Okay, sorry. My clicker finger got ahead of me. This guy's great. Look, it's like he's sporting this belly. It's like he's pregnant. Look at that. And, for all we know, that was a sign of great affluence in Egyptian society. I don't know, but all of these men that appeared like this, they have, the belly and the boobs. Same thing, the droopy belly, the boobs. Same thing, I could go on. It's just, there are tons of the statuary that you can look at and see this. Now, if you start looking at Egyptian paleopathology, which is really interesting, which is really what got me intrigued, you start looking because unlike the last study, the hunter-gatherer studies, mainly anthropologists have skeletal remains to study. With the Egyptians, they've got this massive quantity of soft tissue because they've got all these Egyptian mummies. And these Egyptian mummies are thick on the ground. In fact, it's estimated that there are as many Egyptian mummies as there are living Egyptians, because for centuries they mummified them and buried them away. And in fact, back in the late 1800s, you could go to Egypt and buy a mummy, and here's a guy selling them right here. And they were used, they were used for all kinds of stuff. They were used, they powdered, mummy powder was used as an aphrodisiac. A million different things that mummy powder was used for. I tried it and it didn't work, but that's what it was used. And they had, and they also used these things to make paper. They would shred these mummies and make paper out of them. So these mummies were purchased on the market, and there were tons of them. And along comes this guy named Sir Mark Armand Rufer, who was a doctor, and he started doing autopsies on these mummies to see what was going on, to see if he could find anything. And he had to hydrate the tissue, so he developed a solution called, appropriately enough, Rufer's solution, and it's still used today to hydrate mummy tissue to look at. Although they don't autopsy them as much today because they do it more with scanning, as we'll see in a minute. But Rufer did autopsies on probably over 100 mummies. And he actually drew, if you can believe this, he drew what he saw. So I guess he had one eye on the scope when he did these histological sections and drew them. And these are pictures of arterial disease in mummies. So back then, not only did you have to be a doctor, you had to be an artist. And my looking at these histological sections is kind of like a hog staring at a wristwatch. I'm not likely to get a lot of information out of it because it's not my deal, but I'm sure that people that do know what they're looking at realize that this is a picture of heart disease in the ancient Egyptians. And what Rufer said about it is he said, I cannot therefore at present give any reason why arterial disease should have been so prevalent in ancient Egypt. I think, however, that it's interesting to find that it was common and that 3,000 years ago it represented the same anatomical characteristics as it does now. So these guys that were eating the diet with no sugar, no trans fats, low in fat, high in carbs, were all getting heart disease. And actually, if you look at the mummy data, you see that they had diabetes, they probably had hypertension because you can see arterial thickening, and they were obese. They had folds of skin that they wrapped into their mummy wraps. Eating the diet that every nutritionist would recommend today. Now, we've got some other evidence. We got the Ebers Papyrus, which I just love, and this is an ancient document from whatever this is, 3,500 years ago. And if you read what this says, it says, if thou examinest a man for illness in his cardia, and he has pains in his arms and in his breast and in one side of his cardia, it's death threatening him. I mean, that could come right out of a medical textbook today. These guys anticipated Heberdin by, 3,000 years. So that's the definition of cardiac disease. Right here is what they are calling the earliest record of sudden death, possibly. And you can see it's hard to see, but here's the guy that's collapsed. This is the universal Egyptian symbol of despair. They're comforting his wife. This is obviously something that just happened. And so the guy that wrote this medical paper said this is probably the first recorded case that they could find of sudden cardiac death. And remember, you got the Ebers Papyrus talking about this. This was something common back then on a diet that every mainstream nutritionist would put you on today to prevent heart disease. Now let's look at a couple of famous mummies. This is Hatshepsut, who was a mummy from, come on Hatshepsut, jump up there. Okay, from 1500 BC. And she had, as you can see, some dental problems, and she had, and this is what she looked like. This was the idealized version of her, but she died at age 50, and she was an obese, diabetic female. Now, this is what tooth disease in ancient Egypt looked like, and this is really the characteristic look of it. The teeth are ground down from eating all of this wheat that's not very well ground and that's mixed with sand. I mean, it just ground their teeth down. And this is a common thing that you'll see in every picture of an ancient Egyptian mouth. Now, this is actually a kid. This is a 10-year-old kid. And you can see already that the teeth are starting to be ground down at 10 years old. And so by the time that these people were adults, they were really ground. And you can see that's the characteristic look. Here you can see it. This is a better picture from a scan. You can see all these ground right down to the pulp. Now this had to hurt. And I guess they just lived with it. That was a part of life for them. And here, yet another picture of it. And there you can actually even see a little enamel hypoplasia. Now, as I say, nowadays we don't autopsy mummies as much as we scan them. And there have been a number of groups that have scanned mummies, and they've gotten a lot of information from them. This is actually Lady Ryan. She was both autopsied and scanned. She was 1530 BC. She was a lady in waiting of a famous Egyptian queen. And what you can see in her, and she died at age 30, and what you could see in her was already she was getting a calcification of her aorta, and they think that this is this is calcification of the anterior wall of the heart, and they're thinking that that's from a previous heart attack that she had, the healing of it. And this is a 30-year-old woman. You don't see heart attacks in 30-year-old women a whole lot. Now, this is another radiograph. This is another scan, and you can see again, you can see the typical Egyptian ground down tooth pattern from eating the sand and the wheat. But you can also see in this calcification of the carotid arteries and the subclavian arteries. And if you look over here, you can see that he had calcification in the coronary arteries as well. And the iliacs. Now, So he had a lot of calcification, a lot of arterial disease, and as I say, that's a common finding in these mummies that ate the diet that people would have us eat to avoid heart disease. And if you look at the mummy data, this is what it looks like. Now, this is a study of all kinds of mummies, but the Egyptian data mirrors this. And that's that under 30 years, 15% had it. You get up to 30% from the 30 to 39, 40 to 49, you got a bunch of people have it, and over 50, those are the people that somehow avoided it. Maybe they had good genetics, I don't know. But there are a lot of heart disease in Egyptian mummies. Now, because of these scans, and these are all recent, all the old autopsy stuff went back from Roofer's time, back in the pre-World War I, because he was killed when a ship he was riding was torpedoed in World War I. But a lot of these old autopsy studies were done back then. Then there was kind of a little surge of it back in the 70s, and it kind of went quiescent. And then when people got the ideas that they could scan them, they started scanning the heck out of these things. And then they were really finding all this heart disease. And these were mainstream docs that were doing it. And it was sort of interesting, their take. Now remember, the old papers, the old things that we talked about, the historians that talked about the Egyptian diet based on their research into the history of the Egyptian diet. Now let's look at what the modern medical docs have to say about it. And this is a paper right here, Atherosclerosis in Diet in Ancient Egypt. And I call this a post hoc analysis. The person writing this paper says, the vast bibliography associated with the examination of Egyptian mummies provides overwhelming evidence that atheroma was seen in a variety of vascular beds. Okay, it's common. Clear evidence of vascular calcification, what we just saw, finding associated with accelerated atherosclerosis and increased incidence of coronary artery disease. All true. Here's where we go off the rails. The explanation for these frequent pathological findings almost certainly resides in a diet rich in saturated fat that was confined to the elite while most of the population remained vegetarian. So they're trying to make the case that, okay, all these mummies that we're looking at, they're royalties. They were face down in red meat every day. They ate a lot of saturated fat. They deserve what they got. I mean, they're sort of reverse engineering this thing. And she says, there is unequivocal evidence to show that atherosclerosis is a disease of ancient times induced by diet. That's true, just not the diet she thinks that induced it. Induced by diet, and that the epidemic of atherosclerosis, which began in the 20th century, is nothing more than history revisiting us. And I took inspiration from Dr. Jay Wortman's talk yesterday. This is incredible. And so anyway, just for grins, because I had never really looked at it, I went back and thought, I bet there's some stable isotope analyses of ancient Egyptians. And I started looking in that, pulling up those papers, and sure enough, there was. And what does it tell us? Here's a paper from 2014. And what this paper says, using isotope ratios, the contribution of animal protein to the total dietary protein was estimated here at 29 plus or minus 19%, corresponding to an ovo-lacto-vegetarian diet. Now this is the percent of protein. This is not the total protein. This is the percent of the protein they ate that was animal protein. So about a third of the protein that they got was animal protein. And it says, taking into account potential biases, the proportion of protein of animal origin may have reached 50%. So in some cases, it could have been half the protein they got was of animal origin. Both estimates are lower than the average value of 64% characterizing modern omnivorous Europeans. So you say, okay, well, who cares? These are all the poor people that are out there. What about the royalty? Well, there was another study that popped up that says a rather surprising observation is the lack of differences between isotopic composition of remains of different social classes spanning from the very poor village of Gebeline to the middle class of the rich town of Asyut to the distinguished people who underwent mummification process after their death. They were all the same. They all ate the same amount of protein. The rich people didn't gorge on protein. This is like the old historian said. They ate basically a carbohydrate diet. If the rich people had eaten all saturated fat, they wouldn't have screwed up teeth like they do. And their teeth were as screwed up as everybody else's. So these people ate a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet with no sugar and no trans fat. And they got heart disease, and they got diabetes, and they got obese, and they had high blood pressure. They had all the same things that we have today when we kind of eat that similar diet. And if you compare them With the hunters who didn't have any of that stuff, you can only come to one logical conclusion. So if you look at these different data sources like Mark Cohen recommended, and not just the Western data sources, you find the metabolic constraints that we talked about with the expensive tissue hypothesis, the driving us toward a meat diet in order to develop our enlarged brains. You look at the stable isotope studies that we talked about showing the high meat diet, the super carnivore diet of our early ancestors. You look at the hunter versus farmer studies. You look at the ancient Egyptian data. And you look at the 25 randomized control trials that I showed at my last talk, and they all point in one direction. I mean, to me, there's no other conclusion. So, thank you very much for your time, and I ended up on time.